They called it the Ghost Battery, a phantom force that annihilated an entire German armored column in the frozen Ardennes. But there was no battery, no overwhelming force, just one man in one tank destroyer about to defy every order. It was December 1944. 12 German tanks, a Tiger I at the lead, snaked through the snow-laden woods, aiming for a vital crossroads that would cut off the 101st Airborne. This is the untold story of Private Ray Thompson, the quiet gunner who, without permission, orchestrated a controlled collapse that changed the rules of war. Through a fogged periscope, Thompson watched the steel serpent creep closer, 800 yards away. His hands trembled from the bitter cold. He had no orders, but he saw what no one else could. Imagine this: a vital crossroads, the very lifeline for the 101st Airborne Division, now trapped and encircled in Bastogne. German forces were bearing down on it, threatening to sever every last supply and reinforcement. Ray Thompson had no orders, no green light to fire. His instructions were crystal clear: wait, observe, report. But he saw the inevitable, the disaster about to unfold. So he made a choice. Without a single command, without any clearance, Ray Thompson pulled that trigger. And in that instant, everything shifted. This moment was a stark contrast to the rules laid down just 3 days prior. Inside a cold, drafty farmhouse near the Belgian front, Thompson was hunched over a metal desk. His commanding officer, briefing the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, had been unequivocal. "No one fires without confirmation from command," he stated, his voice flat. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they are. We do not give away our position unless ordered." The room fell silent, the men nodding, but a palpable tension hung in the air. They all knew the enemy was moving, and moving fast. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge had just erupted. December 16th, under a shroud of fog and snow, the German army had unleashed its final massive offensive on the Western Front, Operation Wacht am Rhein. Their goal was brutally simple: cleave the Allied line in two, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. They struck with overwhelming force. Over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, and absolute surprise. American lines shattered, some units vanished overnight, friendly positions changed by the hour. In that swirling chaos, commanders feared a worse enemy than the one in front: friendly fire from behind. So the rule was absolute: wait for orders. For Thompson, this meant observation. He and his 3-man crew were dug deep into a ridge, overlooking a forest road north of Neuville, a key crossroads town just outside Bastogne. They had excellent cover, a vast range of fire, and an icy panoramic view of the valley below. But no permission to engage. Day and night, Thompson's gaze swept the terrain. Through his frosted scope, he meticulously noted tank tracks, counted pines scarred by treads, and sketched enemy movements in a worn notebook his mother had sent him months ago. He recorded every detail: range, bearing, wind speed, yet his finger never strayed to the trigger. Once he'd tracked a lone Panzer crawling near a ravine for almost an hour. No orders came. It passed. The frustration, the anger burned inside him, but his discipline held firm. He understood his mission. He understood the terrible cost of a single misfire. One wrong shell could mean a dozen American lives. Or a revealed position that might take out an entire German battery in return. But as the hours relentlessly ticked by, and more enemy traffic snaked through the dense trees, a new question began to gnaw at him. Was simply holding fire truly the safer choice? Thompson wasn't the type to be reckless. He was meticulously precise. He observed German columns with the same intensity a mathematician applies to complex patterns. He understood their movements, how they strategically stacked vehicles for support, their reliance on tight formations, and, critically, he knew exactly where to strike them, if and when that decisive moment arrived. What he didn't know yet was that he would be the one making that call. So, who exactly was Ray Thompson? Raymond Charles Thompson wasn't born into military life. He spent his formative years in the vast, featureless expanse of western Kansas, a place where the winter winds could strip paint off a barn, and the summer heat would bake wheat fields until they split open like burnt toast. His father, Charles, owned a small engine repair shop in town, while his mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math at the local school. Young Rye grew up immersed in the world of gears, grease, and graph paper. Even as a child, he perceived the world through angles and measurements. He could tell you the exact distance to a grain silo just by the length of its shadow. While most kids played with simple slingshots, Rye engineered one with a pulley system and counterweights, obsessed with launching a pebble with absolute, pure precision. He didn't join the Army out of a thirst for battle. He enlisted in 1942 because he was eager to study engineering, and the Army offered him training, a paycheck, and the promise of a future. He certainly got the training. The pay, well, that was barely enough. And that promised future? It hinged entirely on surviving Europe. By the time Thompson landed in Normandy, he was just 22, yet the war had already aged him 5 years beyond his actual age. His baptism by fire came in the treacherous hedgerows, where the enemy could be mere feet away, and you wouldn't know it until their bullets were flying. He witnessed his friend Jimmy Delgado burn alive when a Panzer shell struck their half-track in a roadside ditch. Another comrade, Frank Murray, was utterly vaporized by a mine outside St. Lo. After these horrors, Thompson stopped believing in luck, or the sanctity of orders, or the illusion of safe distances. Instead, he began to trust only in patterns, in routines. He meticulously studied how tanks moved, where they paused, the exact time it took for a turret to rotate. He started carrying a small spiral notebook in his jacket, and for every German vehicle he encountered, he'd sketch it, meticulously noting its vulnerabilities and blind spots. He wasn't a man of many words. Other soldiers nicknamed him the Quiet Clock, because when he did speak, his words were always short, direct, and usually timed down to the very second. But behind the gun, Thompson was absolutely lethal. He wasn't flashy or particularly fast, just incredibly accurate, predictable in the absolute best sense of the word. To the Army, he was a good gunner, disciplined, smart, always calm under pressure. What they didn't quite grasp, what even his closest comrades didn't fully realize, was that Ray Thompson was also a profound thinker, a natural tactician. He wasn't merely a trigger puller. He saw the entire battlefield like a vast chessboard. And in just 3 days, that quiet conscript with the angle-obsessed mind would completely rewrite the rules of engagement, all in one explosive burst. Because sometimes war doesn't favor those who simply follow orders. It rewards the ones who truly understand when to shatter them. So what exactly was he facing? It was the morning of December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes was shrouded in a thick, low-hanging fog, clinging to every branch like ghostly smoke. Visibility was almost zero, and every sound was muffled, distorted. But through his periscope, Ray Thompson saw them. First, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger I tank, a true beast with its massive long barrel and those iconic snarling square shoulders. Then another, and another. This German column was slithering through the forest road like a cold steel serpent. 12 vehicles, maybe even more. It was a textbook armored assault, clean, tight, and frighteningly disciplined. Leading the charge, that Tiger I acted like a battering ram, capable of ripping through almost anything the Americans possessed. Trailing close were 3 Panzer IV tanks, each one fast, efficient, and lethal. Next, 2 half-tracks packed with infantry. And behind them, support vehicles, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, even mobile field kitchens. Even the very tail of this column was protected, flanked by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a clear sign they were expecting contact, ready for anything. Anything, that is, except one unauthorized American gunner in a Wolverine. The road they were on, it was impossibly narrow, barely wider than the column itself. Steep forest banks towered on either side, thick trees pressing in, practically caging them. No room to maneuver, no space to scatter. To Thompson, this wasn't just a road, this was a deadly trap. But here's the critical catch. Ray had absolutely no orders. No one else on his side could possibly see what he was seeing. Radio contact with his battalion's forward HQ was either incredibly weak, garbled beyond recognition, or simply non-existent. His only option to reach command was to reposition, which meant risking immediate exposure. By all military protocol, he was supposed to just observe the enemy, report their heading, and then let air support or artillery take the lead. But Thompson wasn't just watching a column moving in transit. He was watching a sharpened blade, aimed directly at the throat of the entire American line. The road they were slowly crawling down, it led straight to the Noville crossroads. If those German tanks captured Noville, they'd completely flank the American defenders in Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division, already surrounded, would lose its final vital supply line. The outcome? Absolute catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Americans trapped, freezing, and cut off. Yet these enemy tanks pressed on, calm, utterly confident, convinced American forces were too chaotic, too frightened, too thinly spread to respond. They weren't entirely wrong. Ray Thompson was scared. He was cold. He was isolated. But disorganized? No. He was meticulously calculating. He understood that firing too soon would just scatter them. Hitting the wrong target, the rest might escape or unleash devastating counterfire. But if he struck with pinpoint precision, targeting just the right vehicles in the perfect sequence, he could achieve something most officers would deem impossible. He could systematically dismantle an entire armored column, piece by agonizing piece. And he'd have to do it without a single order, without backup, without permission. He licked his lips, fingers finding the elevation dial. One last look at the formation. He was waiting for a moment no manual had prepared him for. The unauthorized pattern was about to begin. Ray Thompson had never fired without orders, not once. Not in training. Not in France, not even when his gut screamed at him to pull the trigger days earlier, as a lone Panzer briefly crossed his scope. But now, staring at this perfectly exposed German armored column, crawling forward with clockwork precision, a chilling realization hit him. Waiting wasn't caution anymore. Waiting was suicide. And so, with no radio contact, no green light, and nobody to back him up, Ray adjusted the angle, held his breath, and fired. He didn't aim for the lead tank. No, he aimed for the third. The armor-piercing round tore from the M10 Wolverine's barrel with a thunderous roar, shattering the silence and kicking a violent wave of snow into the air. It slammed into the 3rd Panzer IV, directly in its flank. The explosion ripped a shockwave through the trees. A plume of fire and thick black smoke erupted, piercing the fog. Metal shrieked. The entire column ground to a halt. But Thompson? He wasn't done yet. As his loader expertly rammed the next shell, Thompson swiftly shifted position, moving just 5 yards to the left. A slight adjustment, but crucial, enough to throw off any German gunners frantically scanning for muzzle flash. Then he fired again. This time, his target was the 6th vehicle. The blast tore through the half-track, packed with infantry. Its fuel tank ignited instantly. Bodies were violently thrown into the surrounding trees. Flames devoured the dry underbrush, painting the forest floor in chaotic patches of orange and black. The Germans weren't just halted anymore, they were in full-blown panic. The lead Tiger tank tried desperately to reverse, but the column was jammed solid. Its crew screamed and frantically gestured, trying to force a path, but it was no use. Behind them, the entire formation was now a tangled, burning, blind, and inescapable bottleneck. Thompson reloaded, his movements practiced and swift. His crew, now fully alert and understanding the grim ballet unfolding, didn't utter a word. They simply followed his lead. His next target, the 8th vehicle, a fuel truck. The outcome was instant and utterly apocalyptic. A colossal explosion ripped through the hillside, a geyser of flames erupting skyward like a volcanic blast. The sheer force slammed 2 nearby infantrymen to the ground. The monstrous fireball silhouetted the tanks, turning them into nightmarish, ghostly shadows against the inferno. From afar, it sounded like a full-scale artillery ambush. But in truth, it was just one man, one gun, and an instinct honed by months of study. Because Thompson's firing order wasn't random, he had meticulously studied German doctrine. He knew their absolute reliance on tight formations, understood the precise logic of their vehicle placement. Fuel and support at the rear, heavy armor up front, infantry sandwiched in the middle. By eliminating the 3rd vehicle, he created an immediate physical blockade. Hitting the 6th then jammed their entire middle. And the 8th, that fuel truck, didn't just cripple their retreat, it ignited absolute chaos. This was a chain reaction firing pattern, a surgical dismantling of the German tactical structure. Every single shot was a scalpel, precise and devastating, not a blunt hammer. Now utterly confused and cut off, the Germans began firing wildly into the surrounding trees. Their machine gunners sprayed bullets into snowbanks and empty trunks, while infantrymen scrambled for cover behind flaming wrecks, completely unsure where the deadly fire was even coming from. To them, it felt like a meticulously planned trap, an orchestrated ambush by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush, there was no battery. Only Ray Thompson and a crew who had long since stopped asking questions. As the enemy scrambled in terror, Thompson moved again, using the dense forest terrain like a seasoned sniper. He knew precisely how to exploit angles, understood exactly how far his gun could reach without giving away his position. Every single new vantage point was chosen with surgical precision, for optimal cover, for maximum elevation, for ultimate confusion. He wasn't just shooting, he was systematically dismantling them. And with each thunderous blast, it was another critical page ripped from the German field manual. Destruction reigned in the woods. The Ardennes, which had been eerily silent just moments before that first shell, now screamed. Trees cracked and splintered, toppling under the shock waves of pure devastation. Snow, fire, and shrapnel exploded, filling the air like confetti from a hellish celebration. Thompson's third shot had just ignited a fuel truck. His fourth then struck a half-track that had desperately tried to reverse. Its wheels were already spinning uselessly in the icy mud when the shell hit, sending the chassis rocketing skyward in a twisted arc of steel. The German Tiger at the very front was now completely stuck. Its crew tried frantically to reverse, but they were utterly trapped between the flaming wreckage ahead and the immobile vehicles behind them that simply couldn't move without ramming each other. Their tight, disciplined formation, so incredibly effective in open terrain, had, on this narrow forest road, transformed into a steel coffin. From Thompson's vantage point, everything seemed to shift into agonizing slow motion. He watched soldiers yelling, their arms waving wildly, confusion rapidly escalating into full-blown panic. German infantry began to scatter into the woods, abandoning their vehicles. Some dove for cover behind trees, while others sprinted into the deep snow, stumbling and slipping on treacherous frozen roots. One officer, climbing atop a tank to get a better view, was instantly cut down by a brutal burst from Thompson's coaxial .50 caliber machine gun. The crew inside the M10 was now drenched in sweat, not from fear, but from sheer, grueling physical exertion. The loader's hands were raw and blistered. The assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from constantly yelling coordinates. The tank itself reeked of grease, hot metal, and acrid cordite. But Ray Thompson? He was ice, utterly focused. Every single shot he took came from meticulous calculation. Not adrenaline, not rage, just pure, practiced mathematics. He was repositioning after every 2 shells. Not far, just 10 yards here, maybe 20 there, but it was enough to make German gunners constantly doubt their aim. The thick smoke helped. The pervasive fog helped. The challenging terrain helped. But the real, crucial advantage? They thought there were more of him. The Germans were convinced they had stumbled into a multi-unit ambush. Some guessed 4 tanks, others swore there were 8. There were even frantic reports of American artillery batteries in the hills, though no such batteries existed in that sector. The truth was, it was just one M10 tank destroyer, with a 3-man crew, and a gunner who was technically supposed to be following orders. By the 30-minute mark, the road was choked with burning steel. At least 5 vehicles lay utterly destroyed. Another 3 were completely immobilized. Survivors from the rear fuel and support crews had already turned and fled back down the forest trail. The Tiger finally managed to pivot its massive turret, slowly rotating toward the ridge where Thompson had last fired. Thompson didn't flinch. He waited. He knew the Tiger's armor was thickest in the front, but weakest on its sides. And if you knew that precise moment when the Tiger's hull gave just a tiny glimpse of its flank as it repositioned, that was your chance. The 5th shell screamed from the barrel, finding its mark. A searing, bright flash ripped right through the Tiger's side. It held for a heart-stopping second, then the internal ammunition detonated. The entire turret shot skyward in a fiery plume, crashing down yards away. The explosion was so brutal it actually threw the German anti-aircraft gun behind it off balance. Its gunners, dazed, dropped their weapons and bolted into the trees. Now smoke billowed into the forest, thick as low-lying clouds. The mangled wreckage glowed eerily in the dim morning light, and what was once a steady flow of armored power had become a blazing, destructive bottleneck. One of Thompson's crewmen just stared at him, asking, "Are we still going to get court-martialed for all this?" Thompson didn't say a word. He simply loaded another round. The job, clearly, wasn't over. The Germans, though, saw a ghost battery. Hours later, inside a makeshift American interrogation tent, a captured German lieutenant, his face streaked with ash, uniform half-burned, eyes glazed over with shock, fought to form sentences. He spoke in fragmented bursts, stammered, then fell silent. "There were many guns," he managed in broken English, "perhaps 6, perhaps even more. We were attacked by a full battery." American intelligence officers just exchanged disbelieving glances. A battery? No, not even a full unit. There was only one M10 Wolverine out there, and a gunner who, officially, had never even been given permission to fire a single shot. Yet, other German prisoners painted completely different pictures. Some insisted it was an ambush sprung by paratroopers armed with anti-tank weapons. Others swore the Americans had laid mines and booby traps, clear sabotage, not just clever gunnery. One young man, barely 20, was adamant he'd seen muzzle flashes from 3 separate directions. But those flashes? They came from a single source, Thompson, who had moved his position after every single shot. In their utter confusion, the Germans had started inventing enemies that simply weren't there. Fear, pure fear, filled in all the blanks. Even veteran tank commanders reported seeing phantom American armor silhouettes lurking deeper in the tree line. Amidst the chaos of burning wrecks, choking smoke, and crumbling command structures, they conjured up images of what they simply couldn't identify. This wasn't cowardice, it was profound psychology. They absolutely couldn't fathom that one man could have accomplished such a feat. To them, it was utterly impossible that a lone tank destroyer could have struck with such impeccable timing, such deadly precision, and such utterly devastating effect. And in a way, those German commanders were right. This wasn't brute force. This was surgical disruption, incredibly precise. Thompson's decision to target specific vehicles, the 3rd, 6th, and 8th in the column, followed a logic no German unit had ever prepared for. German military doctrine taught that American forces were slow to react, far too dependent on orders from higher up. The prevailing assumption was that Americans were only effective in large numbers, completely incapable of improvisation. But Thompson shattered that expectation. He had fought like a German commander, then he struck like a ghost. One captured prisoner later described it as if the very trees themselves had opened fire. Another claimed to have heard whistling, which might have been a delayed memory of the incoming shells or simply the wind in the trees, horribly distorted by fear. When American forces finally moved in to clear the road hours later, what they discovered stunned even the most hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a perfectly coordinated airstrike. Vehicles were stacked like dominoes, their burned-out frames fused together by intense heat. Frozen corpses lay sprawled across the snow, some still clutching their rifles. Trees were splintered like toothpicks. Tank tracks were bent sideways, dug deep into the frozen earth. But above all, what was missing, what made it so profoundly strange, was the complete absence of American dead. There were none, because there had only ever been one gunner. From that day forward, survivors from that German column would refer to the incident by a single, chilling phrase: Die Geisterbatterie, the Ghost Battery. Was it disobedience, or was it sheer brilliance? For the next 48 hours, Ray Thompson braced himself, fully expecting to be arrested. After the shooting finally stopped, after the smoke cleared and the Germans had either fled or burned, he sat motionless inside the M10. His loader silently offered him a sip from a canteen, but Thompson didn't respond. The adrenaline had completely drained away, and now came the crushing dread. They had directly disobeyed orders. They had fired without explicit permission. And regardless of how many enemy tanks were burning, the military had very strict rules. Back at battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his report. His commanding officer, a captain from Pittsburgh named Langston, read it without uttering a single word. He slowly flipped through the pages, Thompson's detailed sketches, the range estimates, the precise diagram of the firing sequence. Langston's face was a complicated mixture of anger and sheer disbelief. "You know," Langston finally said, his voice low, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those had been friendly fire—" Thompson simply nodded. He didn't make any excuses. "I knew what I saw," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Langston stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "No one authorized this, Thompson. You understand that?" "I do," Thompson replied. Langston did not reprimand him. Not yet. Instead, Langston simply told him, "Go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs." And upstairs meant division command, which for an enlisted man acting outside protocol often meant severe scrutiny and punishment. Thompson returned to his crew. They were quiet too. No backpats, no celebration. They all felt it. They were waiting for the hammer to fall. But it didn't, not immediately, because something else happened first. 2 days later, the scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived. They came through Newville, faces hollow, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and trench exposure. They'd expected to find that forest road swarming with enemy armor. Instead, they found twisted German wreckage. Which unit took this out, they asked. Langston's reply was simple. It wasn't a unit. It was one gunner. Word spread faster than orders. At mess tents, along supply lines, across battalion radios, everyone began talking about the guy from Kansas who had single-handedly taken out a Panzer column. Of course, the story grew. Some exaggerated, claiming it was 10 tanks, that he did it with just 5 shells, that he used bouncing shots like a trick pool player. But even as this legend formed, the official investigation began. Division intelligence meticulously reviewed Thompson's field notes. They interviewed the loader, the assistant gunner, even tried to contact higher command to confirm Thompson's radio situation that day. They couldn't prove disobedience. Why? Because there was no clear record of orders being received. The lines had been jammed. Thompson's crew had tried to report, but nothing came back. What they could confirm, however, was the undeniable kill count. 7 enemy vehicles utterly destroyed, 4 more disabled. 0 American casualties. 1 strategic objective, Noville's North Road, held. An entire airborne unit, cut off and under siege, reconnected to vital supply lines. And one decision, made in silence without clearance, had kept that crucial corridor open. Langston was called in to relay the final disposition. He braced himself, fully expecting a reprimand. But what came instead was far more unusual. The division commander said, "Don't put this in the official briefing. Not yet. But tell your gunner we'll be watching his work." Thompson didn't get a medal, not then, but he wasn't court-martialed. In fact, he was quietly reassigned to train other gunners on firing pattern theory, how to disable convoys through strategic sequence rather than brute force. No one uttered the word hero. No one saluted. But then, something incredible happened. His decision-making diagrams were actually sent all the way to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when it truly hit him. They hadn't just forgiven what he did, they were studying it. Weeks later, as Thompson was meticulously cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle one evening, Langston approached him. "You know," Langston began, "I was absolutely ready to report you for insubordination." Thompson slowly looked up. Langston just shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook," he continued, "the one about controlled collapse. What exactly did you mean by that?" Thompson paused, wiping his hands. "When you pull one stone from a wall," he explained, "the rest falls, if you know precisely where to pull." Langston broke into a smile. "All right," he said, "next time you decide to knock down a wall, just give me a little heads up, okay?" Thompson didn't return the smile. He just nodded. Because for him, this wasn't some grand victory. It was a cold solution, a calculated necessity. And deep down, he knew it could have easily gone the other way. He'd made his peace with that. War, it turns out, doesn't always punish disobedience. Sometimes it learns from it. And that pattern? It actually changed military doctrine. Ray Thompson never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep journals. He never posed for photographs. After the war, he simply went home to Kansas, married a wonderful girl named Helen from the next town over, and opened a small repair shop near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, he built grain silos, he even taught his son geometry by drawing angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others certainly did. Because years after the brutal Battle of the Bulge, the Army quietly started teaching something they called asymmetrical engagement sequencing. It was a fancy term for a deceptively simple yet brilliant idea. Don't aim for the front, aim for the collapse. The specific case study they used, a single, pivotal engagement just outside Noville, Belgium. They'd show grainy overhead maps of a forest road, intricate wreckage patterns, precise vehicle placements, and detailed firing trajectories. No names were ever given, the file was unclassified, but it was buried deep within artillery doctrine manuals that most officers honestly never bothered to read. Yet, the students at Fort Sill and later Fort Benning did study it. Why? Because it worked, because it saved lives, because it completely changed the understanding of what just one gunner could achieve. Not through sheer firepower, but through geometry, through pure logic, through an unwilling willingness to act when orders simply fall silent. Years later, a colonel who, as a young lieutenant, had studied Thompson's very engagement, would summarize it perfectly. He didn't break orders. He operated beyond them. It was the ultimate paradox. Picture a man who openly defied the chain of command, yet became the ultimate blueprint for flexible battlefield thinking. His unconventional, unofficial firing pattern wasn't just a fleeting tactic. It was later embedded deep into Cold War doctrine, specifically training tank destroyer crews to cripple Soviet armored columns across Eastern Europe. The sheer brilliance of the concept? It was about creating artificial choke points through precise selective targeting, then masterfully turning the enemy's own rigid formation discipline against them. This was truly revolutionary, and it sprang from the mind of a Kansas farm kid, someone who had never even stepped foot in a college classroom. Decades later, a dedicated military historian unexpectedly stumbled upon the original field report, penned by Captain Langston. It was buried within a dusty cardboard box filled with World War II after-action reports, marked by a faint, faded red line. The historian, intrigued, tracked down Thompson, now in his 80s, quiet, a little hard of hearing, living a modest life with his wife and their cat Murphy. He gently asked Rye about that fateful day in the Ardennes. Rye took a long, thoughtful moment before answering. "I remember the trees," he finally said. "I remember how incredibly still it was right before that first shot, almost like the world itself was holding its breath." He didn't speak of grand victories or personal glory or even regret. His words were simply about precision, about sheer necessity. When asked why he didn't wait for official orders, he replied, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, just long enough to do exactly what had to be done." That profound answer never found its way into the official history books, but it deeply resonated with the historian, and now, perhaps, it resonates with you too. Ray Thompson didn't win the entire war, but he saved a critical road. He saved a column of paratroopers. He saved a pivotal moment. And in the brutal reality of war, sometimes that truly is everything. He powerfully reminded the Army that courage isn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it simply pulls the trigger. Not out of defiance, but out of a much deeper sense of duty. One gunner, one decisive decision, one brilliant pattern, and an entire German column was brought to its knees.